The Wyoming wind wailed like a banshee, tearing through the frost-crusted plains as the sun bled red behind the jagged Tetons. Amos Kane sat alone in his weathered cabin, the only sound the creak of his chair and the low hiss of a lantern flickering. On the scarred pine table, his calloused fingers clutched a faded daguerreotype, the image of a woman marry her smile, a ghost that haunted him still. 10 years had passed since he'd sworn off the world, trading the chaos of a bounty hunter's life for the solitude of this Wyoming ridge. After the Civil War, he'd chased outlaws across the West, but each bounty had chipped away at his soul until all that remained was this cabin, this silence, and her memory. He'd vowed never to let another soul close, not after what he'd lost. A scream shattered the night, sharp, desperate, unmistakably human. Amos froze, his hand snapping to the Colt revolver beside the daguerreotype. The cry came again. Closer now, raw and jagged, slicing through the storm's howl from the direction of the old creek trail. His heart pounded, not with fear but with a hunter's instinct honed by years of tracking men through blood and dust. He rose, boots thudding on the warped floorboards, and grabbed his Winchester from the wall. Its cold steel a familiar weight. The wind battered the shutters, rattling the cabin like a warning, but no coyote or wolf made a sound like that. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Outside, the air stung with the bite of early winter, the stars swallowed by a brewing storm. Amos moved swiftly, his long gray duster flapping like a raven's wings, his battered Stetson pulled low over hazel eyes that had seen too much death. His lantern swung in the wind, its frail light cutting through the mist, revealing a figure slumped against the split-rail fence that marked the edge of his land. A girl, no older than 18, knelt in the frozen dirt, her wrists bound with coarse hemp rope, her dark auburn hair matted with mud and frost. Her calico dress, faded and torn at the shoulder, clung to her shivering frame, blood seeping through the fabric in dark patches. Her brown eyes, wide with fear yet burning with defiance, locked onto his as he approached, her breath clouding in the cold. "Don't come closer," she spat, her voice trembling but fierce, laced with an Irish lilt that spoke of far-off shores and hard-won survival. Amos stopped 10 paces away, hands raised, his gravelly voice steady as stone. "I'm Amos Kane. This is my land. I ain't here to hurt you." Her chest heaved, her gaze darting like a cornered doe's, taking in his weathered face, the scar across his knuckles, the rifle slung across his shoulder. Bruises marred her arms, fresh purple welts over older yellowed marks telling a story of cruelty no accident could explain. Someone had tied her here, left her to die in the Wyoming wilderness, where the cold could kill as surely as a bullet. He knelt, slow and deliberate, pulling a bone-handled knife from his belt. "I'm gonna cut you free," he said, waiting for her nod. She gave it barely, her eyes never leaving his, sharp with suspicion, but desperate for salvation. The ropes fell away with a flick of his blade, and she collapsed, a soft gasp escaping. Her cracked lips. Amos caught her gently, easing her to the ground beside the fence post. He unhooked his wool scarf, its edges frayed from years of use, and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. From his belt, he pulled a dented canteen, pressing it into her hands. "Drink," he said, his voice low but firm, like a man who'd heard too many lies and offered too few promises. She drank, hands shaking, spilling water down her chin, her gaze flickering between gratitude and distrust. Amos studied her pale face, the mud-streaked auburn hair, the defiance in her eyes despite the pain. "Who did this?" he asked, his tone carrying the weight of a man who knew the answer would cost him. Her lips parted, dry and bloodied. "My uncle," she whispered, the Irish lilt stronger now, thick with bitterness. "He said I was a burden, said the bounty men would pay for me, left me here to freeze or worse." Amos's jaw tightened, his mind flashing to the daguerreotype, to marry, to a promise he'd broken under a different sky. Bounty men, vultures who'd sell a soul for $1, men he'd once ridden with and now despised. He knew their kind, and he knew their price. "You're safe here," he said, but the words felt hollow as he helped her to her feet, her weight leaning into him. Fragile yet unyielding, the storm growled louder, thunder rolling in the distance, and then he heard it, hoof beats, faint but growing closer, cutting through the wind like a blade. Someone was coming, and they weren't far behind. Amos's hand tightened on his rifle, his eyes scanning the dark trail. Whoever had left this girl to die wasn't done hunting, and the past he'd buried was rising like the storm itself. The wind battered Amos Kane's cabin like a vengeful spirit, rattling the shutters as rain began to lash the Wyoming night. Inside, the lantern's glow cast jagged shadows across the log walls, painting the room in hues of doubt and warmth. Amos knelt by the hearth, feeding kindling to the fire, his movements deliberate, practiced, the routine of a man who'd lived alone too long. The girl, Nora, sat in a creaking rocker, wrapped in his wool scarf, her auburn hair still damp with frost, her brown eyes darting door, window, rifle on the mantel. Her calico dress clung to her shivering frame, the bloodstains at the hem darkening in the firelight. She clutched the dented canteen, her knuckles white, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the world. Amos rose, his gray duster swaying, and crossed to the small kitchen corner, pulling an iron pot from a shelf. He worked in silence, slicing potatoes and a slab of salt pork, the knife flashing in the dim light. The smell of sizzling fat and wood smoke filled the air, a faint comfort against the storm's fury outside. Nora watched, her breath uneven, her gaze flickering between fear and a hunger deeper than food hunger for safety, for trust. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her Irish lilt sharp with suspicion, voice rough from the cold. "You don't know me." Amos didn't look up, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. "Don't need to know you to know wrong when I see it," he said, his voice low, like gravel under boots. He ladled the steaming stew into a tin bowl, tore a chunk of stale cornbread, and set them on the table beside her. "Eat. You'll need your strength." She hesitated, sniffing the bowl cautiously, as if expecting poison, then took a slow bite, her hands trembling but steadying with each swallow. The fire crackled, throwing light across her bruised arms. The welt's a map of cruelty no 18-year-old should bear. "Your uncle," Amos said, leaning against the wall, his hazel eyes studying her. "What's his name, and why'd he sell you to bounty men?" Nora's spoon paused, her lips tightening. She set the bowl down, her fingers brushing the scarf around her shoulders. "Declan Shea," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Came over from Galway with me after Ma died. Said he'd build us a life here. But he's a gambler, a drunk, owed money to men in Cheyenne bad men. They wanted me as payment." Her eyes met his, defiance cutting through the pain. "He tied me to your fence. Said they'd find me by dawn." Amos's jaw clenched, his mind flashing to the daguerreotype in his pocket. Mary, her smile, her blood. He'd known men like Declan, men who traded lives for coin, men he'd hunted in his bounty days. "These bounty men," he said. "They got names." Nora nodded, her voice hardening. "Led by a man called Silas Varn. He buys girls, sells 'em to mining camps or worse. Declan said Varn wanted me, special." Her words hung heavy, a truth too vile for the warm glow of the cabin. Amos turned to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. The storm raged, but the hoof beats he'd heard earlier were gone, or had they stopped? He gripped his Colt, the weight familiar yet heavier now. "You're not theirs," he said, his voice a low growl. "Not while I'm here." But as he spoke, a shadow moved outside, a flicker, too quick, too deliberate. Nora's eyes widened, catching the same motion. "They're here," she whispered, her hand tightening on the scarf. Amos slid the bolt across the door, his face set like stone. "Stay low," he said, moving to the rifle on the mantel. The lantern flickered, casting their shadows long and tense across the floor. The storm roared, but another sound grew louder, boots crunching on gravel, closer now, circling the cabin. Silas Varn's men had found them, and the night was about to turn to blood. The storm's howl clawed at Amos Kane's cabin, a relentless beast rattling the log walls as if demanding entry. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of salt pork stew and wood smoke, but the warmth of the hearth did little to ease the chill. Of fear, Amos stood by the window, his hazel eyes narrowed, peering through a crack in the shutter into the Wyoming night. His gray duster hung heavy on his shoulders, the Colt at his hip a cold reassurance. Nora, the Irish girl he'd cut free from his fence, sat rigid in the rocker, her auburn hair still damp, her brown eyes flickering with a mix of defiance and dread. Her torn calico dress and his wool scarf around her shoulders marked her as a survivor of cruelty, her hands clutching the dented canteen like a lifeline. The lantern's flickering light cast their shadows long and jagged across the floor, dancing with the storm's rhythm. The faint crunch of boots outside deliberate, circling had stopped their words cold. Silas Varn's bounty men were here, and the night was turning deadly. Amos slid the iron bolt across the door, his movements steady but urgent, his voice a low growl. "Stay low, Nora. They're not here for tea." She nodded, her Irish lilt sharp as she whispered, "How many?" Amos tilted his head, listening to the gravel's crunch, the distant snort of horses. "5, maybe 6, he said, grabbing the Winchester from the mantel. "Enough to make this messy." Nora's breath hitched, her gaze darting to the door, then back to him. "You don't owe me this fight," she said, her voice rough, but fierce. "You could have left me out there." Amos paused, his fingers brushing the daguerreotype of Mary in his pocket, her smile a weight he couldn't shake. "I've left enough people behind in my time," he said, his tone heavy with ghosts. "Not you." He crouched beside her, checking the rifle's chamber, his scarred knuckles catching the firelight. "Your uncle, Declan Sheehy, say why?" "Varn wanted you so bad." Nora's lips tightened, her eyes darkening with a memory to Ra. "Said I was valuable, something about a debt bigger than money. Declan wouldn't look me in the eye when he tied me up. Just kept muttering about making things right with Varn." Her words cut deep, hinting at a truth Amos knew too well from his bounty hunting days. Men like Varn didn't just collect debts, they owned lives. He stood, motioning her toward the corner. "There's a crawl space under the floorboards," he said. "If it goes south, you get in and stay quiet." Nora shook her head, her brown eyes blazing. "I'm no coward, Amos Kane. I've run from enough." She reached for a poker by the hearth, gripping it like a weapon, her small frame taut with resolve. Amos almost smiled. Her fire reminded him of Mary, of a woman who'd fought until her last breath. But there was no time for memories. A sharp rap echoed from the door, followed by a voice, smooth and venomous, cutting through the storm's roar. "Amos Kane." The voice called, laced with a southern drawl that didn't belong in Wyoming. "You've got something of mine. Hand her over, and we'll leave your cabin standing." Amos recognized the tone. Silas Varn, a name whispered in saloons. From Cheyenne to Deadwood, a man who traded flesh for gold. Amos peered through the shutter crack, spotting Varn in a long black duster, his hat tilted against the rain, flanked by 5 men with rifles and torches, their faces shadowed, but their intent clear. "You're trespassing, Varn," Amos shouted back, his voice steady as iron. "Take your dogs and go." Varn laughed, a sound like broken glass. "You know me, Kane. You rode with men like me once. That girl's mine payment for a debt. You can't settle. Open the door, or we'll burn it down." Nora's grip on the poker tightened, her breath quickening. Amos's mind raced. Varn's words stung, hinting at a past he'd buried, a connection to Mary he couldn't yet face. "They'll have to kill me first," he muttered, more to himself than Nora. He turned to her, his hazel eyes hard but kind. "You ready to fight for your life?" Nora nodded, her Irish spirit unyielding. "I've been fighting since Galway," she said. Amos handed her a small derringer from his belt. "Its grip worn but steady. Aim low," he said. "Legs not hearts." As he moved to barricade the table against the door, a torch flared outside, its light slicing through the shutters. The bounty men were closing in, and the cabin was about to become a battlefield. The Wyoming storm roared like a living thing, its wind clawing at Amos Kane's cabin, rattling the shutters as if the night itself sought to tear the walls apart. Inside, the lantern's dim glow flickered across the rough-hewn log walls, casting shadows that danced like ghosts from a past Amos had tried to bury. He knelt by the hearth, feeding dry pine to the fire, the crackle of flames a faint rebellion against the cold. His gray duster hung loose on his broad shoulders, the battered Stetson resting on a peg by the door. Across the room, Nora, the girl he'd cut free from his fence, sat in a creaking rocker, his wool scarf draped over her trembling frame. Her auburn hair, still matted with frost and mud, framed a pale face marked by bruises, her brown eyes darting door window, the Winchester Rifle on the mantel, her torn calico dress clung to her, bloodstains darkening at the hem, a testament to the cruelty she'd endured. She clutched the dented canteen, her knuckles white, as if it could hold her together against the storm outside and the fear within. Amos rose, his boots heavy on the warped floorboards, and moved to the kitchen corner, pulling an iron pot from a shelf. He worked with the quiet precision of a man who'd cooked for no one but himself for a decade, slicing potatoes, carrots, and a slab of salt pork with a bone-handled knife. The blade flashed in the firelight, its edge catching memories of his bounty hunting days of blood and betrayal he'd sworn to leave behind. The smell of sizzling pork and wood smoke began to fill the cabin, a fragile comfort against the storm's relentless howl. Nora watched, her breath uneven, her Irish lilt breaking the silence. "Why are you doing this, Amos Kane?" she asked, her voice rough, sharp with suspicion. "You don't know me from a stray dog." Amos stirred the pot, his hazel eyes fixed on the bubbling stew, avoiding her gaze. "Seen enough strays to know they don't deserve to be left in the cold," he said, his voice low, like the rumble of distant thunder. He ladled the steaming stew into a tin bowl, tore a chunk of stale cornbread from a loaf wrapped in cloth, and set them on the small oak table beside her. "Eat. You're no good to anyone half dead." Nora hesitated, her brown eyes narrowing as she sniffed the bowl, cautious as a hunted animal. Then she took a slow bite, her hands trembling but steadying with each spoonful, the warmth easing the tension in her shoulders. The firelight caught the welts on her arms, purple and yellow, a map of pain no 18-year-old should carry. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, the daguerreotype of Mary heavy in his pocket. "Your uncle, Declan Shea," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "What's his game, and why'd he leave you for the bounty men?" Nora's spoon paused, her lips tightening as she set the bowl down. Her fingers brushed the wool scarf, as if seeking strength from its frayed threads. "Declan came with me from Galway after Ma died," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, thick with the lilt of her homeland. "Promised a new life in the West, but he's a gambler, a drunk, ran up debts in Cheyenne, big ones. Owed men who don't forgive. They told him I'd settle the score." Her eyes met his, defiance cutting through the pain. "He tied me to your fence last night. Said Silas Varn's men would take me by dawn. Said I was valuable." Amos's jaw clenched, his mind flashing to Mary, her smile, her blood, the day he'd failed her. He'd known men like Declan Shea, men who sold kin for coin, men he'd hunted in his darker days. Silas Varn's name was a poison he recognized whispered in saloons from Cheyenne to Deadwood, a man who traded lives for gold, girls for mining camps or worse. Valuable. How Amos pressed, his voice hardening. Nora's gaze dropped to the floor, her fingers twisting the scarf. "Declan wouldn't say, just muttered about debts bigger than money and kept his eyes on the ground, like he was ashamed, but not enough to stop." Her words hung in the air, heavy with a truth that felt too close to Amos's own ghosts. He turned to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. The storm raged, rain pelting the glass, but the hoofbeats he'd heard earlier had faded, or had they? His hand rested on the Colt at his hip, its grip worn smooth by years of use. "You're not Varn's," he said, his voice a low growl. "Not while I'm breathing." Nora's eyes flicked up, searching his face for a lie, finding none. But before she could speak, a shadow moved outside, a flicker, too quick, too deliberate, followed by the faint crunch of boots on gravel. Her breath caught, her hand tightening on the canteen. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. Amos slid the bolt across the door, his face set like iron. "Stay behind me," he said, grabbing a chair to brace the table against the entrance. The lantern flickered, casting their shadows long and tense across the cabin floor. The storm roared, but another sound grew louder: boots circling, horses snorting, voices muffled by the wind. Silas Varn's bounty men had found them, and the fragile sanctuary of the cabin was about to be tested by fire and blood. The Wyoming dawn broke cold and gray, its light barely piercing the storm's lingering clouds as Amos Kane led Nora through the brush, toward the old barn, their breaths clouding in the frosty air. The hoofbeats of Silas Varn's bounty men echoed, Closer, a relentless drumbeat of danger. Amos's gray duster was streaked with mud, his hazel eyes scanning the horizon, the Winchester gripped tightly in his scarred hands. Nora, her auburn hair tangled, her brown eyes fierce with Irish grit, clutched the derringer he'd given her, her torn calico dress swaying as she matched his pace. The barn loomed ahead, its weathered planks a fragile fortress against the 5 riders in blood-red coats who crested the hill, their rifles glinting under the weak sun. Silas Varn rode at the center, his black duster flapping like a vulture's wings, his cold smile promising blood. Amos shoved open the barn door, pulling Nora inside. The air smelled of hay and old leather, the shadows thick with dust. Up to the loft, he ordered, his voice low and urgent. 2 shots, then reload. Aim low. Nora nodded, her hands trembling but steady as she climbed the creaking ladder. The derringer clutched like a prayer. Amos took position behind a stack of hay bales, his rifle ready, his mind racing with memories of Mary, her smile, her blood, the day he'd failed her. Varn's taunt from the night before burned in his ears. You rode with men like me once. What did Varn know about his past? The first shots rang out, wild and erratic, splintering the barn's walls. Varn's men wanted fear, not precision. Amos fired back, precise and deadly, dropping one rider with a shot to the knee. Another screamed, clutching his thigh, as Nora's derringer barked from the loft. But the third man was faster, kicking in the side door, his rifle sweeping the shadows. Amos lunged, tackling him to the straw-covered floor. They grappled, boots kicking, dust rising. The man's knife slashed Amos's arm, blood soaking his duster, but Amos twisted the blade free, slamming his fist into the man's jaw. Shot rang out from above Nora's derringer, the bullet grazing the man's shoulder. He collapsed, cursing, as Amos staggered to his feet, pressing a hand to his wound. Nora, stay down. Amos shouted, but her face appeared at the loft's edge, pale but defiant. Reloading with shaking hands. Outside, Varn's voice cut through the chaos, smooth and venomous. Kane, you're fighting for a lost cause. That girl's mine, and you know why. Amos's heart lurched, the daguerreotype in his pocket feeling heavier. He dragged the wounded man to the door, shoving him out as a warning. Tell Varn to come himself. He roared. Varn dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel, his black duster billowing. He stepped into the barn, unarmed, hands raised, but his eyes gleamed with cruel certainty. You're protecting a debt, Kane, he said, his southern drawl dripping with malice. Her uncle owed me, but it's more than money. She's tied to you through Mary. Amos froze, his grip tightening on the rifle. What do you know about Mary? He growled, his voice raw with 10 years of grief. Varn's smile was a blade. She didn't die in a raid, Kane. She crossed me, digging into my trade girls like Nora. Sold to the highest bidder. I made sure she paid. The truth hit like a bullet. Mary, his love, hadn't been a random victim. She'd been killed by Varn's men, targeted for exposing his trafficking ring. Amos's vision blurred with rage, the daguerreotype burning in his pocket. Nora's gasp echoed from the loft, her eyes wide with shock, connecting her fate to Amos's loss. You're a dead man, Varn, Amos said, his voice low, lethal. But Varn laughed, stepping back. Not today, Kane, but I'll be back for her. He turned, signaling his men to retreat, their horses kicking up dust as they rode off. Amos slumped against the barn wall, blood dripping from his arm, his mind reeling with the truth about Mary. Nora climbed down, her face pale but resolute. You didn't know, she whispered, her Irish lilt soft with empathy. Neither did I. Amos met her gaze, his hazel eyes raw with pain. We're not done fighting, he said. As the storm cleared, revealing a blood-streaked dawn, the barn stood silent, but the hoofbeats lingered in the distance, promising Varn's return. The Wyoming dawn broke like a promise kept, its golden light spilling over the rugged plains, washing away the storm's last shadows. Amos Kane stood by the Laramie River, his gray duster blood-streaked, his hazel eyes fixed on the horizon where Silas Varn's men had retreated hours before. His arm throbbed from the knife wound, but the pain was nothing compared to the fire in his chest. The truth about Mary, his lost love, murdered by Varn's men for exposing their trafficking ring. Nora, the Irish girl he'd saved, stood beside him, her auburn hair catching the sunrise, her brown eyes steady despite the bruises on her arms. Her torn calico dress swayed in the breeze, Amos's wool scarf still draped over her shoulders, a symbol of the trust they'd forged. In her hand, she clutched a small leather pouch, papers inside evidence of Varn's crimes, stolen from her Uncle Declan Shea's belongings when she'd fled. They'd made it to the riverbank, a hidden skiff waiting under willow branches, their only chance to reach Fort Laramie and a federal marshal who could bring Varn to justice. But the hoofbeats returned, thundering across the plains. Varn hadn't fled, he'd regrouped. 5 riders in blood-red coats charged, rifles raised, Varn at the lead, his black duster billowing like a storm cloud. "Kane," he shouted, his southern drawl sharp with venom. "You can't outrun justice, not mine." Amos pushed Nora toward the skiff, his Winchester ready. "Get to the boat," he growled. "I'll hold em." Nora's eyes blazed, her Irish spirit unyielding. "I'm not leaving you," she said, raising the derringer he'd given her, her hands steady now. Amos nodded, a flicker of pride breaking through his grim resolve. They took cover behind a fallen log, the river's rush masking the crunch of boots as Varn's men fanned out. Shots rang out, splintering wood, kicking up dirt. Amos fired back, dropping one rider with a shot to the leg. Nora's derringer barked, grazing another, her aim true despite her trembling frame. But Varn was relentless, his rifle's crack echoing as a bullet tore through Amos's shoulder, blood soaking his duster. He grunted, staggering, but refusing to fall. "Nora, the papers." Amos shouted, his voice raw. She understood, scrambling to the skiff, clutching the pouch. But Varn closed in, his boots splashing in the shallows, his cold smile fixed on her. "You're mine, girl," he sneered. Amos lunged, tackling Varn into the river, their bodies splashing in the icy current. They grappled, fists in fury. Amos's wound screaming as he pinned Varn's arm, the rifle sinking into the mud. "You killed Mary." Amos roared, his voice breaking with a decade of grief. Varn laughed, choking on water. "She was a fool, like you." Nora's shout cut through the chaos. She stood in the skiff, derringer aimed, her face fierce. "Drop it, Varn," she yelled, her Irish lilt a blade of its own. Varn froze, his smile fading as Amos twisted his arm, forcing him to his knees. The remaining bounty men, seeing their leader down, dropped their weapons, hands raised. Amos tied Varn with his own belt, his breath ragged, but his eyes burning with justice. "You'll face a rope for Mary," he said, "and every girl you broke." They rode to Fort Laramie, delivering Varn and the papers to a marshal whose eyes widened at the evidence, names, dates, proof of Varn's trafficking empire stretching across the West. Warrants were issued, Varn's men rounded up, and Declan Shea's name marked for arrest. Nora, safe at last, stood by Amos as the marshal promised protection. She touched the scarf, her brown eyes soft. "You didn't just save me," she said. "You gave me a reason to keep going." By spring, the plains bloomed with sagebrush and hope. Amos rebuilt his cabin, Nora at his side, planting wildflowers and mending fences. Neighbors, once wary, brought tools and seeds, drawn by her resilience and his quiet honor. One evening, Amos carved a wooden pendant for Nora, a Celtic knot to honor her Irish roots. "You're home now," he said, his voice soft. She smiled, slipping it around her neck, her auburn hair glowing in the sunset. The Wild West of the 1880s was forged by immigrants like Nora, Irish men and women who crossed oceans to build lives from hardship, their courage shaping Wyoming's soul. Their fight, like Amos and Nora's, reminds us that justice and family can rise from even the darkest nights. If this tale of grit and redemption stirred your heart, hit like and subscribe for more Wild West stories that burn bright. Comment below, would you fight for a stranger like Amos or rebuild a life like Nora? Your choice could spark our next tale.